All right, it's 9:35. We're going to call the American Lobster Management Board meeting to order. Good morning, everybody. A couple of last minute conversations wrapping up. Welcome, everyone. We are here for the American Lobster Management Board. Have a number of things to get through. We got an extra 10 minutes, so hoping to end up on time. Let's start off with approval of the agenda. Are there any modifications to the agenda? Pat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under other business, I'd like to bring up an issue with the northern edge that the New England Council is dealing with.
Very good. Thanks, Pat. We'll add that under other business. Any other edits, modifications, David?
Not a edit on the agenda, Mr. Chairman. Are you ready for a comment on that? Under other business, I'd like to have a brief discussion of NOAA proposed rule.
Great. Thanks, David. We'll add that under other business as well. Okay, so we've had two modifications, two additions to other business. Anything else from any other board members on the agenda?
Jason, Allie Murphy had her hand up wanting to ask for something under other business.
We're not. Hey, Caitlin.
Tony, we don't see her hand up, but I see Allie, you're unmuted now. Okay.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Borden beat me to the punch. I was just going to quickly discuss the interim final rule that we published a few weeks ago.
Allie, at least I was having a really hard time hearing you. Could you try that again?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
That was much better. Thank you.
Okay. Apologies. Mr. Borden beat me to the punch. My intention was just to quickly mention the interim final rule that NOAA Fisheries published a few weeks ago.
Excellent. Thanks, Allie. So we've got that under other business, and I'll make sure that we come to you for comment as well there. Thank you. Okay, one more time around. Everybody okay? Anything else for the agenda? Not seeing anything, no other hands online. Okay, so are there any objections to approving the agenda as modified? Please raise your hand if you have an objection. Okay, seeing none, we will consider the agenda with its modifications approved by consent. Good. Let's see, next up is the approval of the proceedings from our May meeting. Any edits, additions, deletions to those proceedings? Not seeing any hands around the table, any hands online? Okay, no hands online. So I'll try this again. Are there any objections to approving the May 2023 proceedings of the American Lobster Board as submitted? Please raise your hand if you have an objection. Not seeing any in the room, any online? Okay, no hands online. We will consider those proceedings approved. Thanks, everybody. Next up on the agenda is some time to take some public comment. So this would be public comment for things not being covered on today's agenda. So I'll look around the room here. Please raise your hand if there's anybody in the room that would like to make public comment. Okay, not seeing anybody in the room with a hand raised. Anybody online? Okay, no hands online either. So that is the public comment portion, and we will keep trucking along here. So next up is consideration of the 2023 Jonah Crab Benchmark Stock Assessment and the peer review report. So we're going to start off with a couple of informational presentations, and to kick us off here is Josh Carloni from New Hampshire. So Josh, whenever you are ready, please feel free to take it away.
Yep, I'm ready. Just want to make sure everybody can hear me and the volume is good.
We got you, Josh, and I can hear you good. It looks like.
All right. Sounds great. So I'm just going to get started here. Caitlin, I guess I'll just tell you next slide. Is that how that's going to work?
Yes.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so just wanted to acknowledge everybody that has been working on this assessment. What seems like over the last 5 years, but I think more realistically, in earnest, it's been probably 3 years. So the technical committee has provided all the data that we needed. They've been great, and the stock assessment subcommittee has been working very hard at this. It's a first time this species has been assessed, so it's been a lot of work. We tried to leave no stone left unturned, and I think we did a really good job with the data we had in hand. And I'd like to give a shout out to Jeff Kipp, who did a ton of work on this and deserves some acknowledgement for sure. And he's here as well to answer any questions as we move forward. So next slide. So the outline for today's presentation is just going to go over the stock structure that we came up with, get into a bit of the fisheries characterization, some of the available data sources we looked at, and finally stock status. Next slide. So for stock structure, we looked at a number of different aspects. We looked at biological aspects, which was kind of the size and maturity, which increased from inshore to offshore at a similar latitude. And then the L50 also increased from south to north as you moved from south to north. And so we also looked at Mass DMF, did a large scale tagging study, and there was no real broad scale movement associated with these guys, a couple outlier large movements, but generally they did not move very much. Unlike lobster, where you'll see some pretty large movements throughout the range, that was not the case, at least with this passive tagging study. It was a T-bar tag study. The other thing we looked at was management considerations. This fishery is tightly coupled to American lobster, as everybody knows, and so making these splits along these lobster management areas seemed to make a lot of sense. The best we could do with that to keep them tied together, as it's largely a bycatch fishery within the Gulf of Maine. As you move to southern New England, and I'll talk about this more as we move forward, there's a targeted fishery. So that kind of brings us to the fisheries characterization. I spoke about that just briefly already, that it's a bycatch fishery in the Gulf of Maine. And then I'll point your eye to stat area 525, 526, and 537. That's where there's a directed fishery in southern New England, and I'll get into that a bit in the next slide a bit more. Data availability, basically the finest resolution we had was by stat area. So that's what we used for this assessment. Most things were done by stat area, and that's where some of these splits are. You'll see this split between offshore Gulf of Maine and offshore southern New England is along those stat area lines. Next slide. So fisheries characterization. So this becomes a bit difficult because first I'll draw your eye to this plot on the right. This is 2018, and what it's showing is the percentage of landings from each stat area. You'll notice that some of those stat areas are grayed out, and that's because they're confidential. But kind of the take-home message here is in the Gulf of Maine, if you look at those stat areas in the Gulf of Maine from Maine down through northern Massachusetts, it's characterized by a low percentage of the total makeup of the coastwide landings, as it's a bycatch fishery. And with a bycatch fishery, there's a high number of participants in this area, but low catch per trip. And so that's kind of how that's characterized. But it's worth pointing out that With that, you have a high number of participants. So if anything changes with the abundance of lobster and they start to target Jonah crabs more, there's the potential for quite a bit of growth. If you look down to the stat areas that I spoke about before in southern New England, 525, 526, 537. In this case, in 2018, about 70% of the coastwide landings are concentrated in just those 3 stat areas. And in some years, that's as high as 83%. So this is where there's a targeted fishery. This is where a lot of discussion was based throughout this assessment. So that's just kind of setting the stage there. And so with the last point here is just that with a bycatch fishery and even a targeted fishery, there's some confounding factors when you're looking at landings, because the abundance of lobster is going to drive that. If you have high catch rates of lobster, they're less apt to take Jonah crabs, as well as market. If there's a high price for Jonah crabs, they may be more apt to, and if there's just generally a market, they may be more apt to land them as well. So that made our job a bit more difficult as well. Next slide. So the available data sources were fisheries dependent data and fisheries independent data. Next slide. And what we looked at for fisheries dependent data were landings, participation. So that's number of trips and permits. I'm not going to present that today, but it is within the report. Catch rates and size structure. Next slide. So these are the landings, and we only went back to 2010 because that was when Massachusetts had available data, and they were a pretty integral part of some of these landings. So this is back to 2010. You can see in the upper panel, it's inshore Gulf of Maine to offshore Gulf of Maine in the top, and then inshore southern New England to offshore southern New England. A couple of things to point out here. Again, those top panels, this is largely a bycatch fishery here. You can see the trends for yourself. But there are a lot of market-driven reasons likely for some of these fluctuations. And then in inshore southern New England, you see that kind of oscillating trend, and it's gone up a touch in the end. But a lot of our discussion was focused around this offshore southern New England area. As you can see, the lobster population declined in this area, and then they started targeting Jonah crabs. You can see that increase in landings. Notice the magnitude too on the y-axis is quite larger here for offshore southern New England. It stays high through about 2019, and then if you look at 20 and 21 in this case, you see a pretty dramatic decrease in that time period. Next slide, and there'll be more on that in a little bit. We also looked at catch rates. So we looked at the CFRF, that's Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation. Their harvesters volunteer and put ventless traps on some of the trawls that they're fishing commercially. And so what you're looking at in that top panel is the offshore in yellow. And it shows kind of a similar trend to those landings with that decline. 20, we don't have 21 in this case, but you see that decline in those later years, kind of in agreement with what we see with the landings there as well. And then the DRM is a modeled CPUE that's trying to get at kind of teasing apart the difference between targeted trips and non-targeted trips and standardizing that catch per unit effort over time. The top panel is the offshore southern New England, and you see that kind of is pretty stable, a little bit of decline in the end, and the inshore southern New England with a general decline throughout. The reference fleet is not pictured here. That was a group of Area 3, Gulf of Maine. We looked at catch per trap haul over time and compared that to some of our fisheries independent surveys and found at least some agreement there. So that was another thing that's not shown here due to confidentiality, but that we did look at. Next slide. The size structure, we looked at size structure from biosampling data from the states and organizations that you see above. We looked at, the data were pretty limited, but we were able to do it by stat area, and we looked at the mean size of males over time. to look for any indication of exploitation, as well as we looked at the mean size of 5% largest males to, again, look for any signs of exploitation. And next slide. So with this, the size structure was generally stable over time. We kind of were a little, it was a bit of a head scratcher whether this was a reliable way to measure exploitation, and it may be due to our short time series here. So it's something we're going to continue to monitor, but these size structure was stable over time. It's worth noting that Canada did an assessment and they had a pretty stable size structure over time, even as they were seeing declines in abundance. So that's worth noting, and the peer review report will have more on that. Next slide. The fisheries independent, we looked at the settlement survey, which was created for a lobster, young of the year, but we also have tracked crab abundance over time. And then the trawl survey with recruit abundance, exploitable abundance, and spawning abundance. Next slide. So this is the settlement survey, and this is all crabs less than 13 millimeters carapace width. And this is for the inshore Gulf of Maine. This was the only reliable area where we had these data for. But you can see these trends over time were generally low in the 2000s, increased in the 2010s, and then seeing a bit of a decline generally with most of these in the most recent years. Next slide. So this is the recruit abundance indices. So this is males in 90 to 119, and these will molt into legal size with their following molt. And so we'll see when we look at the indicators some of these trends in a bit more detail, but a couple things I'll point out here. The top two panels, we did look at this on a coast-wide basis and also a Gulf of Maine wide basis, as well as by each stock. Ultimately, we decided to move forward by stocks and not the Gulf of Maine coast-wide, and that was because the coast-wide index was driven largely by the Gulf of Maine index, whereas landings come largely from southern New England. So it created a bit of a mismatch there. So wanted to point that out. You can see some of these trends for yourself. Another thing I think worth pointing out, which you can see to some degree here, is that in the Gulf of Maine, our trawl surveys showed some correlation seasonally. So the spring and fall, generally, we're showing some similar trends over time, which gave us a certain level of confidence. If those were largely out of whack, it would kind of decrease that confidence. But I think that's worth noting. And then coming to the bottom panel here, that's the inshore southern New England. You can see that those catch rates there, bottom left, are quite sporadic. The inshore southern New England is defined by low catch rates, low encounter rates, high CV. We did not recommend moving forward with this as an indicator. And you can see there's some wild swings where there's zero catch or close to zero, and then a high catch and it goes back down. And then offshore southern New England, bottom right, we'll see these trends in more detail, but we didn't see that spring and fall correlation in the trawl survey indices in that region. That's worth noting. Next slide. This is exploitable abundance. I'm not going to go into the level of detail as I just did. We'll see some of these trends later on, but this is males 120 plus. Next slide. This is spawning abundance. So this is females over 80 millimeters, which is inclusive of the maturity estimates for all the regions. And again, this is coast-wide in the first two panels, and then you can see that it's inshore Gulf of Maine and offshore Gulf of Maine and moving to southern New England after that. Next slide. So stock status, the methods we looked at were an index-based method. Jeff did a lot of work with this. Ultimately, we decided that this was not appropriate for the data we had. There's a poorly defined relationship between catch and abundance, which is an essential element when using this type of method. So we opted for a rather simple stock indicators, which I'll explain. Next slide. So the stock indicators, the abundance indicators were young of the year settlement that we ended up using, recruit abundance, exploitable abundance, spawning abundance, and you can see the sizes associated with those. And you'll see it's great out there. Fisheries performance indicators, we did use those. They are in the report. They're available. I am not reporting on those today. And then the way that we looked at these were we took the time series, calculated the 75th percentile of the time series and the 25th percentile of the time series, and we compared the terminal indicator to those percentiles. And the terminal indicator was the average of 2019 through 2021. And that will be shown here as we move forward. Next slide. So again, this is just a recap of what we're looking at. So next slide. So the inshore Gulf of Maine, the terminal indicators, you can see the red dot is the terminal indicator, and the 25th percentile, I know it's hard to see, but is a solid line, and the dotted line is the 75th percentile. So for the inshore Gulf of Maine, they were all neutral, in the neutral range, which would be between the 25th and 75th, except for Maine 512, which was in the positive. And again, you do see some declines over time, but this is an average of 3 years, and that's where they're landing at this time. Next slide. So this is the inshore Gulf of Maine recruit abundance, and at the top is the mass spring and fall, the Maine, New Hampshire spring and fall, and then the Science Center spring and fall. You'll notice, and this comes into play in a minute, that the Maine, New Hampshire started in 2000, 2001. So it's a shorter time series. It kind of begins during these pulses of abundance that you may have noticed, and that we've kind of pointed out in this report, that the trawl surveys seem to kind of track these pulses of abundance, not so great at kind of interannual variability, but kind of a coarse tracking of an abundance signal, which they seem to be picking up on these pulses over time. So this is neutral for mass, both spring and fall. It's negative for Maine, New Hampshire, both spring and fall, and positive for the trawl survey, the Science Center. And for the Maine, New Hampshire, I just pointed this out, but this being in the negative is likely due to this shorter time series. There's no context of the historical values, which is pulling the 25th percentile up. So that's just at least worth noting. Next slide. So this is inshore Gulf of Maine exploitable abundance, and this is positive for spring mass, neutral for fall mass, negative for Maine, New Hampshire. Again, same shorter time series there, and positive for the Science Center. And you can see that the trends are trending downward in recent years for Maine, New Hampshire. Also for the mass, not so much for the Science Center. Next slide. So this is spawning abundance, and this is positive for spring mass, neutral for fall mass, negative for spring Maine, New Hampshire, positive for fall Maine, New Hampshire, and positive for the Science Center, both seasons. Next slide. This is the offshore Gulf of Maine, spring and fall, and this is neutral for both. You can see kind of that peak in abundance in the mid 2010s in the spring, comes down quite a bit, still in the neutral zone, and the same is showing for the fall, a fairly similar trend. Next slide. So this is offshore Gulf of Maine exploitable abundance, and this is positive for both. Again, you do see those declines. The abundance levels went up pretty substantially, and it looks like around 2015, and have been declining, but both still are in the positive values. Next slide. So this is spawning abundance, and this is neutral in the spring, positive in the fall. You can see kind of a similar dynamic there. Next slide. So this brings us to the offshore southern New England, again, where a bulk of the coastwide landings are coming from. And you can see from the spring and fall, these kind of are showing there's no correlation between spring and fall, as I mentioned. Right now, the spring is in the neutral zone and the fall is in the positive zone. You can see the spring is kind of generally showing a downward decline since the 2000s, whereas the fall is showing more of a positive trend since that time period. There's a lot of variability here. One of the issues with these trawl surveys, there are low catch rates. We don't fully understand the catchability associated with them, but it's kind of the best we had. So next slide. So this is offshore southern New England exploitable abundance, and you can see that this is neutral in the spring, positive in the fall. It's kind of a similar picture to what I just showed. You do see that in the fall, that most recent year has shown quite a bit of decline. That is something that you do see earlier in the time series with these rather large swings. Next slide. So spawning abundance, these are both neutral. You can see the trends there. Next slide, please. So stock status, this was there, as you can see from those trawl surveys, they are defined by generally low catch rates, a lot of variability. Again, we felt like they were picking up on these pulses of abundance and kind of this coarse level of an abundance signal over time. Certainly not perfect, and a lot we still do not understand about them. Catchability in different substrates, how temperature affects their movement, and how susceptible they may be to these gears at different seasons. So there's still a lot of questions. So that first bullet there is kind of the statement we made, is that abundance conditions have not declined to historical lows for inshore Gulf of Maine, offshore Gulf of Maine, or offshore southern New England, and the conditions are unknown for inshore southern New England. And as far as settlement goes, settlement conditions neutral and do not indicate recruitment to Gulf of Maine will decline to historical lows in the near future. And again, that's based upon that terminal indicator and some of the high values we see around that time period. We do acknowledge that there's declines in the settlement survey in recent years, and certainly something to keep an eye on. And settlement conditions are unknown for southern New England. We'll get into this a little bit, but that's one of the big mysteries with southern New England. We're unsure of where recruitment is coming for this stock. The inshore southern New England, they do a settlement survey just as we do in the Gulf of Maine, but they get very few to zero Jonah crabs. So it's likely happening in deeper water, but we're unclear of where that is. And then the last bullet, there's insufficient information to make statements about exploitation. Landings have declined, which is a concerning trend in offshore southern New England stock. But we also realize with the bycatch fishery and with this fishery that there are a lot of confounding factors that go into, such as markets, what crabs folks are seeking out. Jonah crabs is typically one of lower on the desirability standard for that. But so there's lots of different factors that are going into this, but we acknowledge that landings are declining. The CFRF ventless trap is declining, and the peer review, which Rich will get into, picked up on this and really did a good job and asked us for some additional analyses. So Rich will talk about that, but they were really good, kind of bringing some of this into focus. Next slide. Okay, I think I'm going to wait on this, Caitlin. I don't know if we jump right into that or we go to Rich's.
You can go through them and then we can discuss them again afterwards, or we can go
Okay.
straight.
Okay, so we had a lot of research recommendations that came out of this assessment. I don't know the number, but we're not going to bore you with all 45 of them or whatever it was. But we were able to kind of pick our top ones and some of the ones that we think could help us to better assess the stock. Right now, there's so many unknowns that it makes it very difficult to say a whole lot other than kind of monitor these trends, monitor landings. So the first one is collect growth data, particularly for adult crabs in offshore southern New England stock. We do have some growth data that Corinne Truesdale from Rhode Island has collected. Also in New Hampshire, myself and some colleagues have collected some here. But one of the big issues is that when you get to legal size, there's very little molt information. We didn't get any to molt in the legal size range, and I know Corinne had some luck, but still not once you get into that larger size range. So we don't know the growth increment or the time period between the frequency of how often they molt, which is a big unknown and would really help us to better be able to assess this stock. Growth is very important. Conduct video surveys for a snapshot of total stock size and improved understanding of catchability. Again, I mentioned some of that, the issues with catchability in different substrates, temperatures, how that relates to what is actually going on the bottom. The third one, research spatiotemporal settlement dynamics and recruitment source for offshore southern New England. I think I mentioned that as well. Where a bulk of these landings are coming up from, up to 83% in some years. We have really no idea where recruitment for those individuals or that portion of the stock is coming from. So that's a big unknown. And then what environmental drivers, ecosystem drivers are kind of driving the recruitment process. And then lastly, determine how to interpret fisheries dependent data considering drivers of these data streams. And that gets back to some of these confounding factors we talked about, better understanding how these maybe catch rates work over time, and what factors are really driving this, market value, things of that nature, to better understand these landings. And so that's all I have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Josh. Great job getting a lot of information. It's always easier when you have a single model that you can report output from. A little more challenging when you have to cobble a bunch of things together. So we are going to hold questions for now, go right into the peer review. I hear that as well. I'm just going to power through it. Okay. We're going to go right to Rich's presentation. They're very closely related. So please hold your questions for now, and we'll circle back. Hopefully Josh will hang out with us for a little while, and we'll come back to all of your questions for both Rich and Josh. So Rich, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here. The review workshop was conducted in late August, and we focused on all aspects of the assessment, including data methods and overall judgment of the assessment and quality for management of use. Next slide. The review panel consisted of Dr. Paul Rago, former chief of the Population Dynamics branch of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, Dr. Chris Sidden, shellfish biometrician from Alaska Fish and Game, and myself, Rich Wong, another biometrician from Delaware Division of Fish and Wildlife. These panel members have extensive experience with stock assessments. Most importantly, they have personal expertise in data pour methods, trawl and trap surveys, invertebrate stock assessments, and crab population dynamics and ecology. As outlined in the commission framework, the panel has no affiliation with the Jonah crab assessment or management. As such, we were tasked with obtaining an unbiased judgment of the quality and appropriateness of the assessment for use in management, and to provide for research, provide recommendations for research and improvements to the assessment. Next slide. Overall, the stock assessment was well done. This was a data limited assessment, and as such, it had associated challenges. These challenges made ascertaining stock status extremely difficult. Despite this uncertainty, there were some clear declining signals evident in the fishery. And given this uncertainty and recent concerning signals, the panel felt that it was essential for the commission to closely monitor stock indicators on an annual basis for the next few years to better understand the nature of these recent declines, rather than waiting for the next assessment cycle. Next. In reviewing this assessment, a compelling story emerged to the panel. We see a fishery that has grown tremendously in the relatively short period of time. Landings rose 30-fold in the span of about 2 decades. The fishery is based on a fairly long-lived crab, which is a common bycatch species in an immense lobster fishery. This crab has become so valuable that it supports a substantial fishery in its own right, peaking at nearly $20 million in ex-vessel value. However, we see steeply declining landings occurring over the past 4 years of this assessment. In fact, landings have declined 51% in the main producer region of the offshore southern New England over this period. And so we are now at a pivotal part of the story. Where does the story go from here? What lies ahead? Are we at the beginning of a bust phase in a classic boom and bust arc, or is this decline caused by factors unrelated to stock decline? Next slide. What makes the story particularly worrisome is that we've seen an almost identical setup in the early stages of the collapse of the Canada Jonah crab fishery in the early 2000s. In the first 4 years of this crash, landings had fallen 59%. By year 7, landings had declined 97%, and the stock no longer supported a fishery. In retrospect, Canada DFO concluded that Jonah crab biomass was severely depleted despite relatively low fishing pressure and on a male-only fishery. So to evaluate the appropriateness of this assessment, the panel was tasked to formally address 9 terms of reference. In the following slides, I will state each term of reference and summarize the panel's main conclusions. Next slide. Term of reference 1, evaluate thoroughness of data collection and the presentation and treatment of fishery-dependent and fishery-independent data in the assessment. The data collection in the assessment was comprehensive and thorough, and the SAS did an exemplary job of justifying whether they included or removed data sources. Data source variances and caveats were clearly presented. The panel agreed with the SAS's decision to summarize and report data for 4 distinct regions, given different fishery dynamics and potentially different stock dynamics between these regions. Throughout the review workshop, there was considerable discussion on how effective trawl surveys are for capturing stock signals for Jonah crab. As an illustration, 1 out of every 5 annual index values was 0. This indicates very low catchability success in these trawl surveys. For the future, any success and the success of any future assessment will depend on identifying and developing a synoptic index of abundance. Next slide, please. Tour 2, evaluate empirical indicators of stock abundance, stock characteristics, and fishery characteristics for their appropriateness to monitor the stock between assessments. The SAS presented a large number of stock indicators that Josh went over earlier. It's consisted of 53 fishery independent surveys and 4 fishery dependent indices. These fishery independent indicators in bulk did show positive long-term trends across time series of greater than 40 years. Let me see the next slide, please. Here's a stoplight diagram, courtesy of Dr. Rago, showing all 53 fishery independent indicators. As you can see, really want to just focus on the green, the colors of the values, with green being positive. As you can see, most of the positive values are in green are seen in the later years of the time series. However, the panel also recommends to interpret these indicators over a more recent time frame. Next slide, please. This is because of a potential regime shift that's beginning in around 2010. Pictured here are the young of the year indices. And we see much higher recruitment stock and higher stock productivity beginning in 2010. Next slide, please. So to better evaluate current stock status, it might be more appropriate to view the indicators relative to 2010 to current. As you can see here, there are very few green lights in the past couple of years of the assessment. So we have somewhat conflicting long-term versus short-term signals from fishery independent indicators. Next slide. However, the indicators that were most worrisome were fishery dependent. Next slide. The most conspicuous is this 51% decline in landings in the OSNE over the past 4 years. But the more concerning indicator is the declining fishery dependent CPUE in Rhode Island. That's the top panel. Yeah, the bottom panel shows this preliminary analysis of fishery catch per unit effort based on directed Jonah crab trips only. You go to the next slide, please. So when we prepared this presentation, we revisited the fishery independent indices, but this time focusing especially on the last 3 to 4 years. Next slide, please. Next slide. You can go again. Thanks. We did see sharp declines in recent years in almost all of the fishery independent indicators in the most recent years of the surveys. These are the young of the year indices. This is the inshore Gulf of Maine recruit indices. Here are the inshore Gulf of Maine exploitable crab indices, the inshore Gulf of Maine spawner indices, the offshore Gulf of Maine recruit indices, offshore Gulf of Maine exploitable crab indices, offshore Gulf of Maine spawner indices, offshore Southern New England recruit indices, offshore Southern New England exploitable crab indices, and the offshore Southern New England spawner indices. The panel does want to be careful to not overstate these very recent fishery independent declines. However, the consistency in these declines in the most recent years was notable and is a source of anxiety. Next slide, please. What's that? Okay. Oh, jeez. Given the steep drop in landings and declining fishery dependent CPUE and the very recent drop in the fishery independent indices, again, the panel recommends to continue monitoring indicators on an annual basis. Tour 3, evaluate the methods and models used to estimate population parameters and biological reference points. Data limitations precluded any methods to estimate population parameters like population size and fishing mortality rates. Other methods were employed. These include trend analyses, correlation analyses, construction of traditional and model-generated abundance indices as indicators, and using reference-based quantile thresholds to evaluate these indicators, and index-based methods. SAS did a good job of stating any assumptions and caveats contained in these methods. Next slide, please. Tour 4, evaluate the diagnostic analyses performed. This is a rather generic term of reference that's usually intended to explore the stability in models that are used to estimate population size and fishing mortality rates. In this assessment, a large array of correlations were conducted, which could be considered diagnostic analyses. These correlations were used to investigate cohesion and indices across life stages and regions. Another diagnostic analysis was the exploration of potential climate impacts and survey catchabilities. Overall, diagnostic analyses were appropriate, and the SAS was transparent in its decisions, methods, and was critical and objective in evaluating their analytical results. Next slide, please. Tour 5, evaluate the methods used to characterize uncertainty and estimated parameters. Again, this is a term of reference that's more applicable to assessments that estimate biomass and fishing mortality rates, FMSY or quotas. In this assessment, uncertainty was quantified when appropriate, and otherwise was stated and acknowledged by the SAS in the report. Next slide, please. Tour 6, recommend best estimates of stock biomass, abundance, and exploitation. Although the SAS was unable to generate estimates of abundance and exploitation, the panel did provide guidance towards future modeling efforts. Obviously, a high priority is to develop and identify a synoptic index of abundance. With a synoptic index, catch survey analysis, depletion models, or surplus production models would be logical models to pursue. More complex model, length-based models are possible, but require more substantial length sampling and growth information. If aging is possible, this would be a complete game changer and would open up tremendous assessment possibilities. Next slide, please. Tour 7, evaluate reference points and stock status determination. Stock status is, the panel considers stock status to be highly uncertain, owing largely to the fact that population estimates and biological reference points were not available. SAS did present other status determining criteria that we discussed earlier, that Josh discussed in his previous presentation. In general, these criteria portrayed positive long-term trends, but some worrisome recent signals. Other favorable factors do exist. One, it is unlikely that recruitment overfishing or overfishing on juveniles is occurring, since the minimum size limit appears to be adequately specified. The fishery also appears to select crabs larger than this minimum size limit. Female harvest is minimal in this fishery. This provides a significant moat around the potential depletion of female spawning biomass. And again, long-term trends in fishery independent indices are positive. The concerns are sharply dropping landings and declining fishery dependent CPUE, and some very recent drops in fishery independent indices. These somewhat conflicting signals in the fishery independent indices are not necessarily surprising for Jonah crab. Next slide, please. In the Canada Jonah crab stock collapse, fishery independent trawl surveys were not very effective at detecting the declining stock. However, the declining fishery dependent catch per unit effort was observable preceding and during the stock crash, as you can see in the top figure. Again, you see at the bottom, the Rhode Island fishery dependent CPU on the bottom figure. Next slide, thanks. Tour 8, review and prioritize research recommendations. These were discussed at the review workshop, and the panel supports the SAS's prioritized research recommendations. In addition, the panel put forward these specific recommendations. One, to continue and to develop and refine these fishery-dependent indicators, including an examination of the Massachusetts directed fishery CPUE, and to formally incorporate, if possible, local knowledge when interpreting this fishery-dependent data. 2, to continue and possibly expand the CFRF ventless trap research. 3, investigate surveys with higher catchabilities, such as the defunct winter bottom trawl survey, as potential directed Jonah crab surveys. And 4, to increase monitoring of female metrics, such as operational sex ratios in surveys and sea sampling, spawning potential ratios, and potential sperm limitation. Tour 9, recommend That next slide, thank you. Recommend timing of the next stock assessment. It was difficult to recommend a precise timing for this next assessment. However, it is clear, what is clear is that the commission should not wait until the next assessment cycle to monitor indicators. It is imperative to understand the nature of these recent declines. That being said, 5 to possibly 10 years are probably needed to attempt population modeling. The panel recommends convening in 5 years to summarize ongoing work and progress towards the next assessment. Furthermore, the panel felt that implementing a decision process might be helpful in identifying and preventing potential collapse in the stock. Next slide, please. To conclude, the Jonah crab stock is highly uncertain because of data limitations that prevent traditional population estimates. As well, is also uncertain due to the recent concerning recent fishery signals. Annual monitoring is critical in the near term to determine where this Jonah crab story is heading. In light of these conclusions, the panel felt it was important to, 1, identify and prioritize candidate indicators, to conduct a formal annual review of these indicators, and to develop a methodology for making decisions in response to indicator patterns. Lastly, the panel would like to thank the stock assessment team and the commission staff for a highly productive and collegial workshop, and for the timeliness in their reports and additional requests for analyses. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great, thanks so much, Rich. Okay, so excellent reports from the stock assessment team and the peer review team. So why don't we clear up any questions that folks might have for Josh or Rich. So anyone with questions, please raise your hand. I saw Bill high at first, so go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, just a quick question regarding the collapse of the Canadian fishery. Is there any evidence that since that collapse, there's been any kind of recovery in those geographical areas involved?
That's a good
Go
question.
ahead, Rich. Yeah.
That's a good question. To my knowledge, I don't think the fisheries has never recovered from that collapse. That occurred, but the assessment was conducted, in I think it was in 2009, more than 10 years ago. The Canadian assessment. So that is that is a recommendation that we gave to the stock assessment team, is to do a post-mortem investigation into that, a deeper post-mortem investigation into that Canadian stock collapse.
So there is no post-collapse monitoring taking place at all?
Not to my knowledge, nothing has been, I haven't seen anything published about that.
Good, Bill. Next up, I have Mike Louisi. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure who this question's for, but maybe somebody can help me out. So I think, I certainly appreciate the presentation, and it's concerning to see declines that we're looking at. And I just wonder, as far as prosecuting the fishery, I know that we had discussions in the past about whole body and versus claws and things like that. Is there any information about the distribution of the catch, whether it's whole body, the whole crab harvest versus the claw harvest? I'm wondering, the idea behind the claw harvest is that the crab will actually survive. But I'm not sure where that lie. I know the fishermen in the South, many of them just use the claws, but if there's any additional information about whole body harvest, I'd be curious to see what that looks like.
I can take a stab at that to start, and if anyone wants to jump in, they can. The last estimate I think that we saw is less than 1% is just claw harvest. And there are states that do not allow it at this time. Myself and some others actually did some research on mortality rates associated with declining Jonah crabs, and it was as high as 70% when removing by hand both claws. So that information is in the assessment. And if I don't know if that answers your question or not, but
yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Next up, I have Doug Grout. Go ahead, Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is, I noticed in some of the different areas, the degree of the decline was different. You know, clearly to me, it showed that in the offshore southern New England, it seemed like that's where there was the most dramatic declines that are occurring. So my question is the best available science right now that this is a single stock of Jonah crab?
Thanks, Doug. That might be one for Josh or Jeff. Josh, you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, so I guess, are you saying, is it one coast-wide stock, Doug? Is that where your question is leading?
Yes, Josh.
Yeah, so the information that we had, we did split it into these 4 different stocks. Some of it, of course, was based on management, and it was tied tightly to the lobster fishery. But some of it was on biological data where we're seeing differences in size at maturity, as well as a lack of movement of these crabs, large scale movement. There's obviously still a lot to learn with larval dispersal. We don't fully understand that yet, but as currently constituted, it is 4 stocks, and this southern New England area is its own stock as we assessed it in this assessment. Of course, there's still a lot to learn, but that's how it is now.
I'll just add to that in the report, there's a comparison of indices from the Science Center's trawl survey in adjacent stat areas that are right in that offshore southern New England and offshore and Gulf of Maine stocks. And the trends are pretty different in those 2 areas. So it does seem that there are also some differences in trends and abundance going on between those areas.
Good, thanks. Good info. So next up, I have Steve Train.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure who might be able to answer this. You know, when we took this species on, I wonder if we may have actually created a derby for a while. I mean, fishermen aren't the same as we used to be. If somebody starts talking about limiting something, we go as hard as we can to make sure we don't get something else taken away from us. And if that happened, we would land a lot more of anything for a while, and then they'd be bound to see a decline. And so I wonder if the effort on this could have been taken into account because of the when we started managing it, and there was a worry. I know we're dropping below pre-management levels, but even that I think could be taken into account. There were some things in this that didn't look as bad as others. There's a lot of neutral there, and I wonder how much of that could be attributed to management more than what the traditional fishery and the stock would look like.
Good question, Steve. So maybe Josh, to take a crack at that one. I think you guys talked a lot about these external factors. So maybe you have a comment on that.
I'm not sure I fully understood the exact question, but I think one way that I look at it is when we're just talking about southern New England, which is where I think the concern seems to be generally right now due to the high exploitation rate there. So when we're talking about that southern New England stock, the reason that started to be fished so heavily was due to the decline in the lobster fishery in southern New England. And so as the lobster fishery declined, they started to target these Jonah crabs and these specific areas. And that's when the landings just skyrocketed and stayed high for a period of time. And only in the last 2 or 3 years, looking at the landings, has it been declining quite a bit. That does also coincide with a higher price per pound, which adds to some of that concern level as to why those landings are declining. But at least in southern New England, I think it's highly tied to what's going on with the lobster population there. And that I guess would be the concern in the Gulf of Maine with a high number of participants. You know, we're seeing some declines in the lobster population in the Gulf of Maine, but it's still compared to historic values at a very high level. So, that would be the concern. If the lobster population continues to decline, are these guys going to shift to Jonah crabs? And then you have a pretty high exploitation rate, and you could deplete the resource fairly quickly, at least according to what we saw in Canada.
Thanks, Josh. Follow up, Steve.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. I think, Josh, I think you got the concept of what I was saying, but I'm wondering if this peak effort, of course, may have caught a larger crab for a while as more people went harder, but has this effort peak dropped off so that maybe if you take into account that peak in effort for a while, maybe leveling off, that the stock may level off on its own? I mean, essentially, this is a male-only fishery. There are females, but the size alone has made this almost a male-only fishery. How we put more broodstock on bottom is beyond me, and that's one of our general tools. So I'm not saying I don't want to manage something, but I'm wondering if this might level off on its own.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate that. Roy, you are up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering from either Josh or Rich, if the troubling recent declines in fishery dependent and fishery independent indices, we're admitting that those are troubling. Are they responsible for what we're seeing, or is exploitation responsible for what we're seeing, or is it a climate change effect? I'm just curious which of those two might be more important, or is it too difficult to say? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Roy. I think that one was directed to Rich if you want to take a crack at it, but I think we could lateral that one as well over to Josh or Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Roy, you are correct. That is very difficult to answer that question. The conclusion was that almost everything was uncertain. The stock status was uncertain about for the stock, and that's because we know so little about about its biology, its life history, and the appropriate years to assess as indicators. I guess I would probably pass this off to Josh.
Yep, either Josh or Jeff, feel free to chime in.
Hey, Josh, I was just going to offer a comment. I don't know, you might have to add to it, but one of the things that we saw, particularly in the Gulf of Maine indicators, was that there appeared to be this boom and bust type population dynamic going on. And we saw an increase in abundance in the early 2000s across trawl surveys. It was very clearly picked up in the indicators that we have. And that was at a time when there was really no Jonah crab fishery, even in southern New England. And that pulse went away within a couple of years. We saw that again in the mid 2000s, but it was considerably larger. There was a significant increase in abundance. We saw it across trawl surveys. And that's what we're seeing in the most recent years of this assessment, is a decline from that all-time high. And so it seems like there is another boom in abundance, and we don't know the drivers behind that, what is causing these boom and bust type dynamics. But that was one of the things that we grappled with in this assessment, that we did see across the indicators, that we don't know what the declines are in those boom periods.
Anything to add, Josh?
No, I think that covers it pretty well. There's just a lot of uncertainty still, and it's hard to answer questions sometimes when we just simply don't know.
Great, thank you. Is that any follow-up, Roy?
Well, the reason I posed that question is I'm just wondering if we need to take action to avoid the collapse that happened in Canada happening in offshore southern New England stocks. Do we need to do anything, or is it out of our control, basically? Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Roy. That was an excellent segue for transitioning on the agenda here. So thank you for that. So not seeing any more hands around the table, not seeing any online either. Certainly if folks have additional questions, we can address those, but let's move forward. So we have a couple of options for how we can proceed today per what Roy was just wondering. And so maybe at the highest level, I'll just sort of, let folks know what I was thinking, kind of looking at the agenda. So we could do nothing. It's always an option. We could potentially approve the assessment for management use and then develop some tasking for the technical committee to look at some things that you're interested in that will help you to kind of understand a little better whether we should take action. So that's kind of like the middle road. And then we also could approve the agenda approve the assessment for management use. And if somebody's ready to go, wants to offer something, you could do that as well. I have a favorite amongst those threes, but I'll let you all discuss. So that's kind of how I see the conversation going here. So I'm going to start off with Dan McKiernan. Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it possible to accept the assessment and stop short of new management, but actually put more efforts into monitoring?
So sorry, Dan, just to make sure I'm clear, you would recommend you'd approve the assessment and then you'd make some research recommendations. Is that your idea?
Yes, thank you. Something in that realm, I'm thinking raise this particular species up in terms of priority species for future research and for attention in terms of funding priorities, because it seems like even if it's just at a minimum, making sure that the states continue to do what we've been doing to maintain that. I mean, we already know that we've got some challenges with trawl surveys, for example. And if we need to continue to study the fishery dependent data, make sure that states are providing that data and those analyses. So I'm wondering if we can stop short of management, but ramp up the monitoring attention.
Okay, gotcha. So absolutely, that's an option. And the way so the first part's straightforward. The second part, the way I'm kind of interpreting, one way we could approach that is we could ask the technical committee to kind of look at the research recommendations and offer which subset of them we think they would, or which ones they would recommend that would meet the goal that you just offered of raising this species up, give, the subset that would give us the most information to kind of begin more robust monitoring of this stock. So that could absolutely be a way to go. We'll take a few more comments here. Dave Borden.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. To me, that sounds like a logical way to move forward, but I guess my suggestion, a part of this that I'm a little uncomfortable with is the marketing aspect of it, and I realize that's not an issue that we traditionally get involved in, but right now you can't, the average fisherman could literally catch tens of thousands of pounds of Jonah crabs, but there's no market for them right now. You can't sell the product. So I would be comfortable approving the assessment for management, or just approving the assessment and asking for technical advice on some of the elements you outlined. But I think one of those should be to try to get some more information on why the market is in the condition that it's in, because that may lead us to very different management conclusions than we would ordinarily take otherwise. Thank you.
Really good point, David. I think that's aligned with what Steve Train was offering earlier as well. Okay, let me just check around the table. Doug Grout, go ahead.
Yeah, I like Dan's suggestion, but I have concerns that if we ask the TC to, and they give us suggestions about things we could do to improve the monitoring here, that's going to take a while to develop. And if we continue to see these declines, it's not going to be as valuable as it is 2 years from now as it will be 5, 10 years from now. I personally like the suggestion of the peer review panel that we increase the frequencies of the updates on what we have right now. Now, whether it's annual or every 2 years, it depends on what our capacity of our stock assessment committee is with all the other things that they are involved in. But I certainly would support Dan's suggestion for 1 or 2 things that can improve things for the long term. But I think right now we're at a point where we need to keep a close track of the stocks with the data that we have at hand. And if you'd like a motion on that sometime, I would be glad to put it forward. If you give me a minute.
Okay, thanks, Doug. And just to offer a thought, they're excellent comments, and I wonder, again, to sort of understand the optimal frequency of how often we should be looking and what of the things we already have we should be looking at could be a task to the technical committee as well, just to get a little advice back on that. So I'll just offer that thought so you can think on that a little bit. Dan McKiernan, go ahead.
I'd be happy to make a motion to accept the peer review and the stock assessment for management use if that would move the discussion forward.
Yes, thanks for that. So we've got a motion on the table. Is there a second? I see everybody in Maine and New Hampshire wants a second. So I'll go with Steve Train. I saw his hand first. So motion from Dan McKiernan, seconded by Steve Train. Looks like that's making its way up there. Great. So the motion's made by Dan. Anything further you want to say about that? I think, okay, you're good. Anything, Steve, from you on the motion before we, okay. Any other discussion folks want to have before we take action on this motion? Any hands online? Okay. All right. So why don't I'm going to give folks maybe 1 minute to chat. It's because of the hybrid. So if you need to connect with anyone online to make sure things are okay, let's do 1 minute caucus and then we'll call the question. Okay. Back to, does anybody need more time? You can raise your hand if you do. I'm not seeing any hands, no hands online. Okay. So we have a motion before us to accept the Jonah Crab benchmark stock assessment and peer review report for management use. Motion made by Dan McKiernan, seconded by Steve Train. Let's go ahead and call the question on that. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand, including folks online with a virtual hand. 10. Okay, so that was 10 in favor. All those opposed to the motion, looks like 0. Any?
Mr. Chair, you have a hand up from NOAA Fisheries, Allie Murphy, and I don't know if that's opposed or she's trying to do something else. She's
Allie,
put it down, but
your intention.
Apologies, Mr. Chair, I meant to vote yes. I had my hand up at the wrong time.
Okay, it was hard to hear you, but I think you said you meant to vote yes.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. So we missed a hand online. There are 11 yeses. There were 0 no's. Any abstentions? Oh, that's everybody. So no abstentions, no votes. Great. So the motion passes. Thanks for that, Dan. So we got that part settled. Now we can get into some of the other comments that were made about potential tasking to the technical committee or otherwise. So I see a hand from Steve Train first. Go ahead, Steve.
Just trying to move this along. I'd like to make a motion to task the technical committee with the possible management options to correct what appear to be deficiencies in the health of the stock, whether they be seasonal closures, increased vent size, or other options.
Okay, we'll just get that up on the board. Hang on a second. We're just pausing to get the motion up on the board. Okay, how does that look, Steve?
Yeah, that's fine. I don't need examples. I just gave them when I was giving the motion.
Okay, so looking for a second to the motion. Deb Grout seconds the motion. Okay, discussion on the motion. I think this is starting to, create the tasking list for the technical committee here. So Steve, I'll hand it over to you first if you want to offer anything.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I spoke earlier to it. I'm not sure what more we can do, but I'm not a technical expert, and I'm hoping that there might be some advice on how we might be able to correct this. If we're already leaving the females on bottom, maybe they need more males down there. I don't know, but it seems like that's the tool that we go to on most things, and we're there already. So hopefully they got some advice for us.
Thanks, Steve. Doug, anything to add? Nothing from Doug. David.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm fine with a motion, but I kind of view this as a two-step process. And the first step being that some of the technical folks would at least talk to the industry, processing industry, and try to figure out the dynamic of what's going on in terms of the market implications. And then bring that back hopefully by our winter meeting. And then we could decide whether or not specific management actions, we wanted them to target specific management actions. So if it's all right with Steve, it would be kind of a two-step process. I just don't want to waste a lot of technical time on this if it's not going to be placed in the right arena. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I saw Dan McKiernan's hand.
I have a question for the motion maker. It says deficiencies in the stock. Was it meant to be deficiencies in the stock assessment?
Go ahead, Steve.
Actually, no. I think most stock assessments might have flaws, but I think as a whole, they're accurate or close to accurate. And this one says that the stock may have issues.
So just to offer an interpretation, and Steve, you can absolutely correct me if I'm off, but the stock deficiencies I think he was talking about are the declines that we're seeing in some areas. Okay, Roy.
I was wondering if I might tack on to David Borden's suggestion. While the technical committee considers the task before us there in Steve's motion, if they could also examine if the market is potentially very important in terms of effort, then they need to let us know whether effort, in fact, directed effort, it has declined or is it staying fairly constant. So I would add effort to that examination as well.
So I'm going to try and round. Okay, I'm going to see if I can try something first. So I think we've gotten some good feedback on the motion. The motion is pretty broad, but what I'm hoping is we can kind of keep this rather than getting into a series of amendments and just define that, the tail end of the motion, what folks are interested in seeing are some economic, indicators that we can sort of pull into the analysis. And so we heard things about market. Roy offered changes in effort and what might be driving that. So we have this kind of broad motion of tasking to the technical committee, we've had some discussion that I think defines that a little bit more for them. And so if it's okay with the board, I'm hoping we can kind of stick with that as we task the technical committee. They will have, you know, a little more detailed information from the discussion. So is everybody okay? How about the ASMFC folks? Am I okay with the logistics?
Yeah, I think as long as we're clear on the record what the board is looking for from the technical committee, we don't need to add everything into a motion. So we just want to make sure on our end, we are going to be having the technical committee look into the market factors that could be affecting this, recommending any monitoring improvements, and looking into effort in the fishery, as well as other factors.
That sounds right to me. Anyone want to add anything in addition to what Caitlin just summarized? Doug?
Maybe you indicated this, but just to get a feel for how frequently we can have that updates. Is it 2 years or 1 year? Be great if it'd be annual, but I'm not sure they can handle it.
That's awesome, Doug. So yeah, that's an important one. So getting some feedback from the technical committee on the frequency of the informational updates that we get is also an important one to get feedback on. Good. Okay. Does anybody need time? Can you raise your hand if you need time to caucus with folks who are online? I'm not seeing any hands around the table, so. Okay, so we have a motion before us. It's been seconded. Are there any objections to the motion? Please raise your hand if you object to the motion. Dan, go ahead.
Question just came up in our delegation. When would we get a report back from the TC?
I believe we can have a report back by the winter meeting with recommendations.
Next meeting in January?
Jeff, does that sound all right to you? Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks for that, Dan. Okay, try again. So that wasn't an objection, just to be clear. Any objections to the motion? Please raise your hand. Looking around the table, no hands. Looking online, no hands. So the motion passes by consent. Great. Thanks, everybody. Good discussion. Let's move on to our next agenda item. This is consideration of the annual data update of American lobster indices. And Kathleen, I believe, is online. And if you're ready, Kathleen, we've got your presentation up, so please take it away whenever you're ready.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, we've got you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Coming out of the 2020 American Lobster Stock Assessment, it was recommended to provide data updates to the board between assessments to allow for evaluation of potential changing trends in stock abundance. The objective of this process is to present information that could support additional research or consideration of changes to management between assessments. Next slide. The data sets that I will present are those that may indicate the exploitable lobster stock abundance conditions in the future. Those data sets are the trawl survey indicators, including recruit abundance and survey encounter rates, ventless trap survey sex-specific indices by statistical area, and young of year settlement indicators. The updated data since the assessment include 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. This is the third update provided to the board since the 2020 assessment. Next slide. To show relative status, we use a baseline from the assessment time series to understand potential changes in condition. For each assessment time series, below the 25th percentile is considered negative condition, between the 25th and 75th is considered neutral, and above 75th percentile is a positive condition. The terminal indicator status for each index is a 5-year mean. To determine the status, we compare that 5-year terminal indicator status, or mean, from the assessment including 2014 to 2018 to the most recent and updated 5-year status, mean of years 2018 to 2022. Next slide. We do have some notes to consider. COVID-19 had impacts on trawl survey sampling efforts in 2020 and will continue to impact our updated 5-year mean in this period of 2018 to 2022. Any data or past errors that lead to changes from previously documented values are described in your meeting material memo appendix. And next slide. So the figures shown on the slides only display the annual values as a time series, but the memo in your meeting materials includes tables with the assessment and updated 5-year mean values. The red dots and lines in all of the figures represent the updated data since the last assessment, while the black dots and bold lines are the data time series considered in the assessment and data determining the 25th and 75th percentiles. The solid line is the 25th, below which is negative, and the dotted gray line is the 75th, above which is positive. Between the horizontal lines represents neutral conditions. We will start with the Gulf of Maine Young of Year indices. All updated 5-year means were neutral, which is an improvement from the assessment because both Southwest areas were negative during the assessment. When looking at individual years, the 2022 Young of Year indices increased from 21 in all areas except 514 in the bottom figure, and all 2022 values were in neutral status except 511 at the top. Next slide. For the Gulf of Maine Trawl Survey recruit indices, the indicators are showing signs of decline since the assessment. The Maine New Hampshire Fall Trawl Survey updated 5-year mean changed from positive in the assessment to neutral in the update, while the others remained positive since the assessment. Looking at individual years, the 2022 values for 3 of the 4 inshore indicators were neutral. The offshore indicators from the Science Center Trawl Survey remained positive. It is important to note that 5 of the 6 indicators were not available in the 2020 year due to COVID sampling restrictions. Next slide. For encounter rates in the Gulf of Maine, the rates remain high, but are showing deteriorating conditions since the assessment. All 4 of the inshore indicators were neutral, whereas only 1 was neutral in the assessment, showing relative declines in index condition. The updated 5-year mean for the 2 offshore indicators remained positive. Again, 5 of 6 indicators did not collect data in 2020. Next slide. For the Gulf of Maine ventless trap survey indicators, the surveys have shown declines since the stock assessment. For the updated means, 6 of 8 updated means were neutral and 2 were negative, compared to 4 positive and 4 neutral and no negative means during the assessment. 2022 values for both sexes in 512 and 514 were among the lowest observed in the time series. Next slide. Switching to Georges Bank recruit abundance from the Science Center Trawl Survey, conditions exhibited a slight improvement since the stock assessment, where 1 mean moved from neutral to positive and the other remained neutral. Both the 2022 annual values were both positive and relatively high. These indicators tend to be noisier than some of the other abundance indicators with high interannual variability and lack of discernible trends. No indicators were available for Georges Bank in 2020. Next slide. For encounter rate in Georges Bank since the assessment, both means were positive and similar to the assessment. Next slide. Moving to Southern New England, the updated 5-year means for Young of Year were all negative, while only 2 of 3 were negative in the assessment. There's been only 1 non-negative annual indicator observed since the assessment, and no Young of Year have been observed in Massachusetts for the past 8 years. Next slide. For recruit abundance from trawl surveys in Southern New England, conditions have declined since the assessment, with all updated 5-year means negative. In the assessment, 3 of the 8 indicators were neutral. All annual values for 2022 were negative and marks the first year values have been negative across all recruit indicators for Southern New England. 6 of the 8 indicators were unavailable in 2020. Next slide. For Southern New England encounter rates, the conditions have deteriorated since the assessment, with all updated means in negative condition, with 2 changing from neutral to negative since the assessment. All encounter rate indicators were negative in 2022 for the second year. Next slide. For Southern New England ventless trap survey, there has also been a relative decline. In the assessment, all 4 indicators were neutral, while the update shows that 2 have changed to negative and 2 remain neutral. All 2022 values were negative, the second year where the annual values have been negative across all indicators, ventless indicators. It is important to note that ventless trap has only taken place in Southern New England during depleted stock conditions coinciding with an adverse environmental regime, so interannual variability can be misleading without the context of a longer time series encompassing varying stock conditions. Next slide. So in summary, the Gulf of Maine indicators show declines from the time series highs observed in the assessment. Georges Bank shows slight improvement, while Southern New England shows continued unfavorable conditions with further signs of decline. And then this slide. So at the May 2023 meeting, the board voted to approve Addendum 27. So we have added the calculated trigger index to the data update memo and presentation. Just as a reminder, the trigger index is based on 3 recruit abundance indices, including the Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts trawl surveys, fall and spring, and the model-based ventless trap survey index. Only the size range of 71 to 80 millimeters are considered as part of these 3 recruit indices. The addendum determined a 35% trigger defined by the decline in the combined recruit indices from the reference period of 2016 to 2018. The assessment found the trend from the indices correlates with overall abundance. The annual index is calculated as a 3-year rolling average, so 1 year cannot trigger action. Next slide. So this is the trigger index calculated through 2022, and the combined index is in the yellow square. And the combined index showed a 39.1% decline from the reference period and has crossed the trigger. And I will now hand it off to Caitlin to address the management component.
Thank you, Kathleen. So just as a reminder, Addendum 27 established that the management measures triggered under Section 3.2 would be implemented by June 1st of the calendar year following meeting the trigger. This means in year 1, which would be 2024, the LCMA 1 minimum gauge size would increase to 3 5/16 of an inch or 84 millimeters. In year 3, which would be 2026, the LMA 1 minimum gauge would increase again to 3 3/8 of an inch. And in year 4, the LMA escape vent size would change to 2 by 5 3/4 inches rectangular or 2 5/8 circular. And then finally in year 5, 2028, the LMA 3 and outer Cape Cod maximum gauge size would decrease to 6.5 inches. Next slide. So Kathleen and I can both take questions.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Nice job getting through the data update, and thanks for helping out there at the end, Caitlin, with the management response to the trigger. So we have a set of data in front of us, and I'll just open it up here to the board for discussion, questions to start. So any questions for Kathleen or Caitlin? No hands around the table. Any hands online? No hands online. Okay. So we have a set of information. This is a possible action item. So I'll look around the table, and I think I see someone already with their hand up. So Pat, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think when we were sitting here in May that we expected to be hitting the trigger as quickly as we did. Certainly, the presentation from our TC chair shows some troubling trends. If you all recall, at the May meeting, there was also a lot of discussion as it pertains to Canada and the differing gauge sizes between the US and Canada and how problematic that could be. And so the board did, with the approval of the policy board, develop a committee to work with Canada to try to address some of those issues. We have, in good faith, had 2 meetings. We've got another one coming up. We've got a town hall meeting with industry in Canada scheduled in January. And what I'm worried about is the fact that we could have some really negative trade connotation associated with an early action. And I'd like to, with the approval of the chair, put a motion on the board to kick this conversation off. And if I get a second, I'll be happy to give some rationale.
Thanks, Pat. So yeah, let's get that motion up so that we have something to focus the discussion. So whenever you, let me, while they're sort of consulting, let me check one more time just to make sure there aren't any questions around the table. Okay, not seeing any hands. So looks like we might be ready to go here, Pat. So whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has gone through several iterations, so hopefully the staff has the correct one, but it's a motion to amend the approval of Addendum 27 to change the implementation date. The implementation date for all management measures shall be January 1, 2025, including those measures triggered under Section 3.2. Year 2 and Year 3 measures would be implemented by January 1 of the following calendar year for which they are required.
Thanks. It looked like we had an older version that flashed up on the screen, so hang on a second.
I would just say, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the time that many board members have given me over the past week to try to perfect this. You know, I just want to make sure it's clear for the record. I mean, I was the original maker of the motion that developed, that started this whole process to be proactive instead of reactive. I do not want to have any, I don't like the idea of these delays with the trends that we have in place, but I do think it is critical that we do have time to play out the issues that we have started with Canada to try to solve some of these problems.
Great, thank you, Pat. And it looks like we've got the right version up on the board. So we've got a motion up on the board. Is there a second? Seconded by David Borden. So Pat, I'll turn it back to you for anything further you want to say on the motion.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S.-Canadian issue is certainly the one driver here. I've already spoken to that. There is the ongoing issue we do have in our board packet through the supplemental material, the issue of whether gauges can be put together or constructed in time for the potential June 1 trigger. You know, David Borden and I have talked about that. There's probably some other ways around that particular issue, but it's still one of those things that needs to be addressed. And Maine has a very unique problem as it pertains to differing size gauges with Canada, which is the gray zone issue. Certainly, it's not the problem of everybody around this around the table here, but it is a serious issue when boats fishing right beside each other from 2 different countries. One is having to throw that back and the other is retaining that product. So having some additional time to see if that can be worked on as well would be beneficial.
Thank you, Pat. David, do you wish to speak to the motion as well?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I basically agree with the points that Pat has made. I second this because I think it's a good compromise in terms of the timing. I've always been a little uncomfortable with a rule change for a fishery that affects 5,000 license holders. if you do it in June or July, I think this, in other words, the time period will link up better with kind of a down period. My only reservation about this is I'm still a little bit concerned about the aspect of state regulations and how they will follow. And I'd like to have some discussion of that. We could have that, include that in this discussion, or we can do it separately, whatever your preference is. But my point is very simple, that I think that the states should start their regulatory process now, as soon as possible. And I would particularly emphasize that I think the federal government needs to start its regulatory process soon, given the fact that we're at this meeting, we're going to be discussing federal compliance with regulations that were approved 10 years ago. NOAA needs to step up to the plate and start their own regulations and have this be seamless so that when the gauge changes take place, all of the areas have their regulations in place. I think that's critical for our enforcement agencies collectively. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Yeah, so, it's a really good point, kind of keeping with the philosophy of Addendum 27, being proactive. And so to have folks kind of thinking out ahead of the regulatory processes so you're not kind of stuck at the last minute. So please, folks, feel free to comment on that as we're going around the table as well. So other discussion, Dennis Abbott, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Could we ask Pat to elaborate a little further on the issues with Canada beyond the gray zone, the economic issues that we're dealing with, and whatever might be informative to the board?
Yeah, please feel free, Pat.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Dennis. So the subcommittees had two meetings. The first one was, kind of a more informal meet and greet to understand the management processes from each country. The second one was to understand both the science and the assessment work that is ongoing between the two. It was a very interesting conversation where Kathleen Reardon presented for the U.S., talked about high level from our assessment and that, things look good from an assessment standpoint, but we're seeing some troubling trends. Canada's presentation was strictly their assessment. And painted a very rosy picture, but it wasn't until they looked at our very proactive approach to management that I felt like there was some really positive comments around, okay, we are starting, and probably not positive from their standpoint, but seeing some negative trends in Canada as well. The market implications are such that when you have that small product that's potentially going to come back into the U.S. to fill that chick market, that live chick market, that can be very problematic when you're selling everybody's seen the twin lobster special, when it's two chicks, and we're not going to be able to sell into that market. So I heard loud and clear from the industry. In fact, we heard loud and clear from the industry in our own public hearing process from the commission that the industry was very concerned about this from a market standpoint. So you have both that market component from a harvester perspective, and then on the dealer processor side, there's a lot of concern being expressed to me from the processors about not being able to bring that product in. Now, the document does give some flexibility to each state to allow that to happen, but I think what we would run into probably state by state is quite a conflict between harvesters and the processors. And I think trying to rectify that with a consistent gauge would help alleviate any of that consternation between the two user groups.
Okay, Dennis. Okay. So because of the nature of the motion here, I'm going to look to Bob Beal to kind of clarify what exactly needs to take place here. So go ahead, Bob.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this is a little bit outside the normal Robert's Rules of Order. It falls under the special provision that the commission has developed for amending or rescinding a previous final action. So This motion will require a 2/3 vote of all the members of the board, and it's, so it is, usually you can't go back and sort of just vote to change a final action that's already been approved. The commission has set up a special rule where that is allowed. This falls under that, and it's in the rules and regulations. So the only unique thing here is it's a 2/3 vote, and if this is approved or any other similar motion, it will in effect modify the addendum 27 document. So it's sort of it's actually changing the approval of that addendum. So happy to answer questions on that if there are any.
Any questions for Bob? Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Bob, for that explanation. You said in effect, it changes the final rule. Would it in fact change the printed document on the web? Like, would it be an amended addendum 27? So in historical record, we would know going forward that this change was made. Is it captured there?
Yeah, we would update the actual addendum on the website with notation of to capture the changes and the actions the board took.
Good. Dennis.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. For Bob, clarification, I think we've been through this before. It's 2/3 vote of those present and those who abstain. Are they counted as part of the 2/3? I remember that with the service voting and not voting.
Go ahead, Bob.
It's 2/3 majority of all the members of the board. However, if the federal agency were to abstain, that abstention doesn't count against it, and the math changes a little bit. So this board, has a total of, I think, 12 votes, and if depending on what happens with the federal service, it may be 11 or 12 votes. Is that 11? Okay. Right. So the New England, it gets a little blurry. New England Fishery Management Council technically has a vote on this board for Jonah crab issues, but this is not a Jonah crab issue. So there's 11 votes. So if the National Marine Fisheries Service were to abstain, so the denominator of our math would be 10. So it gets a little confusing.
That's how we like it here in the fisheries world. Okay. Thanks for all that. Really good discussion on the logistical elements of this. Important to know. Yeah, Ray King, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this, I guess, a motion to amend, but I would like to go back to the Director of Maine, and I support this motion, Pat. Can you give us a percentage on certainty dealing with Canada? So in January 25 at that winter meeting, we're not coming back and saying, well, we didn't strike a deal with Canada yet. I think I'm asking for a time certain date.
Thanks for that, Ray. My seatmate was going to flip a coin. I mean, that's the certainty we have, right? I mean, we don't know how we're going to end up in these conversations, but I can tell you clearly on the record, it is not my intent to come back to this board and ask for further delay. I think we have to, in good faith, negotiate with Canada to see if there is any room for change. And if there is not, then we have to figure it out on our own on how we're going to implement the gauge change. Sustainability needs to rule the day.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Ray. Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for the record, I wanted to say the state of Maryland will support the motion delaying the implementation for till January 2025. I understand why that could be necessary and don't see very many concerns at that. What I'm mostly concerned with, and I don't know if anyone else caught it, but there was a yawl that came out of Pat Kelleher during that motion. That was the most concerning thing I've heard all day. And we're in the midst of watching stocks fall apart at our hands. So I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
I'm going to fully admit, and Jeff Kalin and the chairman and Steve Train witnessed me eating grits this morning. And that's the only thing I can contribute it to.
They're not going to let you back in when you drive north.
Okay, let's see, David, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick point that on this issue of dealing with Canada, if we pass this motion, it becomes much more a certainty that we're going to take action on a specific date. And if the states start their regulatory process, that will be backed up by that. And then when we get into the next discussion with Canada, we're going to be saying it's definitely taking place and this is the date. And that's the committee that Pat chairs will be in a much stronger position to get into resolving that issue. Thank you.
Yep, thank you for that, David. So I've got Allie Murphy online. Go ahead, Allie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me better?
Yes, that's good.
Great, thank you very much. I just wanted to let the board know that I don't support this motion. Looking back at the meeting notes from the May board meeting when Addendum 27 was approved, Regional Administrator Pentney urged the board to be as aggressive and proactive as possible in setting these resiliency measures. And those were difficult decisions, but I think it's important that they be adhered to, especially as it's going to be several years before we see any results from any action that is taken. So again, I would urge the board not to change course from what was originally approved in the addendum, and I'll be voting no on this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Allie. Dan McKiernan.
To follow David Borden's point about timing, if we can get a lot of these rules implemented soon, then the gauge manufacturers will know it's time to produce the gauges. And I think the manufacturers are nervous about producing a bunch of gauges that if this board were to change courses again or delay again, they'd be left holding with a lot of inventory that they can't sell. I do have a question on the year 2 and 3 measures. I don't know if that's a typo. I'm trying to remember what was supposed to happen in year 2 and 3, but weren't there also some measures going forward in years 4 and 5 maybe? So I wonder if it's clear that all future measures would be kicking in on January 1st, and this would include the maximum gauges that are supposed to come down. So I'm not sure that year and 2, and I just noticed this, I'm not sure that we've got that nailed down. Like I'm totally supportive of the January 1st start. I just want to make sure this motion isn't confounded some way.
No, it's a good question, Dan. So Kaylin, go ahead.
I think as long as it's clear on the record, I can work with it. But if you would like to modify your own motion, I would, if you were going to do that, I would just add that all additional measures would be implemented by January 1st of the following calendar years for which they are required.
And Caitlin, I took this directly from the implementation of Addendum 27. So implementation of Addendum 27 does not indicate anything beyond year 3, if that is helpful at all. But this is a direct quote from 27.
Yeah, understood. I think the addendum states that measures would occur a certain number of years after other measures, so it doesn't actually say the year for each one. So
yeah, I think it's.
Go ahead, Pat.
We look at this stuff and it becomes too clear to us as we're looking at it. But I mean, the intent is to stay on the exact same schedule, only we're moving it out starting January 1, and then the schedule would continue from there for year 2 and 3. And then I think Doug made the motion that was finally on the event change, pushing it out to year, which I believe was year 4. Yeah. So those would all, everything would remain the same. And I think as long as we can clearly state that on the record.
David?
Quick point, Mr. Chairman, if you wanted to consider a 5-minute break, I'm sure the staff could amend that schedule and put it up on the board. And that way it would be totally clear to everybody.
Okay, good suggestion, David. I think we will take maybe 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes here. What we're going to do is we're going to put up the table that clearly identifies the timeline here so everyone can look at it, agree to it, and then we can move forward from there. So 3-minute break, and then I'll call you back to order. Okay, let's have everybody come back to the table. We are back. So what we have going on here is we have the original motion made by, I don't have a very loud voice, so I'm not going to try and talk over people. That was my stern finger wagging. So what we have is the original motion made by Pat Kelleher, and then we've inserted below the motion an updated table that identifies all of the exact dates when all of these measures would become implemented. So hopefully that clarifies the intent for everybody. This is how it will be documented. I'm getting a thumbs up from Pat with that. And David, are you also okay with the way we have this laid out? Okay. So any further discussion needed on the motion? Not Steve, go ahead.
I figured if I'm the only one in the room who's actually directly impacted by these actions, I should say something. I support them. I didn't want to delay it, but if we don't get it right, it could be even worse. So if we need to delay 6 months to make sure we get this right the first time, great.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. Okay. Not seeing any hands around the table. Before I call the question, there is a hand in the back that I missed, and thank you to Marty for flagging that for me. So we're going to have some public comment. There's a public microphone up here to my left, your right. Please come on up, state your name, and make your comment. And thanks. Sorry I missed your hand before.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time to speak. My name is Dustin Delano from the New England Fishermen Stewardship Association. NEFSA supports Commissioner Kelleher's motion. We take Addendum 27 extremely seriously. And as a lobster fisherman myself, I'm proud to be a part of one of the most sustainable fisheries in the world. And while we prefer a 1-year postponement, 7 months would certainly be better than the alternative. And just to reiterate a couple things, back in May, no one expected that this trigger would be met this year in just a few months. And, a couple other things with the data sets that we're using. As Kathleen Reardon stated, the 2020 data is missing quite a bit of information from the surveys from that year. And I think it's real important for us to also realize how much of a contributing factor climate change has been with our fishery. As someone who's fished for over 20 years, and most of my fishery was in federal waters, we have seen a huge increase in small lobsters off there. A lot of us don't even come inshore anymore, and haven't for many years. When you're fishing and hauling a trawl out of 70, 80 fathoms of water, and you're catching lobsters that are 2 inches long and Jonah crabs the size of your thumbnail, there's definitely something going on in that deeper water. And, aside from my comments, I really have advocated and tried to encourage for increased surveys and science in that deeper water, because there's definitely some big changes happening offshore. And, just again, to reiterate, we've heard the same concerns about the ability to get gauges in time, in a timely manner, for the June 1st implementation in 2024. So the 7-month delay would be extremely beneficial for that. And I think it's important for us to remember as well that a 35% decline, if I read the graphics correctly, would still keep us above the 2000 to 2010 survey numbers. When I look at it, I of course have had trouble for a long time at using 2016 to 2018 as sort of the reference period, because that's sort of, at the ceiling. And so I just think that these measures are certainly, proactive rather than reactive, which is a very new technique for our fisheries. And I also just want to add to the Canadian inequity issue as well, being a Maine fisherman. And while I don't fish the gray zone, I know many guys who do. And it would be incredibly difficult to be trying to conserve a resource and throw back lobsters that would just be caught up by other boats that you're fishing around. And as a harvester, when I look at this gauge increase, I see that the harvesters are going to take a brunt of the impact. But what I could see as a positive thing would have been possibly an increase in demand for our product, where there would be less product on the market. But with the inequity, with the Canadians having dealers just go by us and bring that same product across the border into the markets, would take away the one advantage that we would possibly have. So I would just appreciate it if you guys would consider this motion. And I've definitely learned one thing this morning, that I won't be eating grits this week because I'm not changing my New England vocabulary. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate those comments. We have one other public comment that we're going to take from someone online. Virginia Olson, please feel free to unmute your mic when you get when you're able, and make your comment, and hope you'll be as succinct as our last speaker.
Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree with Dustin and appreciate Commissioner Kelleher's comments as well. That is a good motion. We were hoping for at least a full year to be able to delay this before we start. I know I'll just, in closing, highlight some of the things that our membership saw, and that is the same, the inequities be addressed on conservation measures between Maine and Canada before instituting a gauge change, a new rule for no importing products that are not harvestable in Maine waters, and the federal rules must be adjusted for current and future gauge measures to be implemented federally, so we have consistency there. We also had two members suggest that two ventless traps go to every license holder, and those traps be hauled twice a week during their season, and everything recorded out of those traps. It would be nice to have some of that information implemented before we have to go to our gauge change. That's why our membership voted and asked for a 2-year delay, but anything would be better than June. So we really appreciate that you're looking at an extended timeline. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. Appreciate the comments. Okay, so back to the board here. We are now officially 3 minutes over time, so I think we need to get to business here. So does anybody need time to caucus? There's been a fair amount of time to chat as we were getting organized here. So not seeing any hands around the table. So I'm going to go ahead and call the question on this motion. Please keep in mind what Bob mentioned earlier about the logistics. Okay, and Caitlin is going to call out the states as we go along here. So all those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand.
Keep them high, please. Right, New Hampshire, Maine, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island.
All those opposed, raise your virtual hand, or anyone at the table also raise your hand.
I don't see any hands up for opposition.
You have NOAA Fisheries.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you.
Any that's everybody, right? Okay, so no abstentions, no null votes. So by my math, we have 10 in favor, 1 opposed, and I think we've met our threshold. So the motion passes. Thanks, everybody. All right, so we're over time. So Jeff and I consulted, and we're both going to go super fast on our agenda items here, and I bet Caitlin will too. Okay, go ahead.
We can take up the FMP reviews by email vote.
So Caitlin's going to be faster than both Jeff and I with that. So with that, Jeff, next up is the terms of reference and the timeline for the Lobster benchmark stock assessment. So go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So a memo was provided in meeting materials with 3 components to consider for this agenda item. Next slide, please. The first component is the terms of reference for the assessment. These are terms of reference to be addressed by the TC and SAS during the stock assessment, which I'll present here in a slightly abbreviated format. The second component is the terms of reference for the peer review. These are TORs to be addressed by the peer review that reviews the stock assessment upon completion by the TC and SAS. These are essentially the same as the assessment TORs, but directing the review panel to evaluate the TC and SAS's fulfillment of the stock assessment TOR. So I won't go into detail on those. The final component is the timeline of the assessment, and I'll present this with select milestones following the assessment TORs. And the objective of this agenda item is to consider the TORs and timeline for approval so the committee can begin to work on these TORs. Next slide, please. So jumping into TORs, TOR 1 is to estimate catch and catch at length from all appropriate fishery dependent data sources, including commercial and potential discard data. Next slide, please. TOR 2 is to present the abundance data being considered and or used in the assessment. Next slide. TOR 3 is to evaluate new information on the life history, such as growth rates, size at maturation, natural mortality rates, and migrations. We do have a sub TOR here to consider any new information on growth for potential to update the growth transition matrices used in the assessment models. Next slide, please. TOR 4 is to identify, describe, and if possible, quantify environmental climatic drivers. TOR 5 is to use length-based models to estimate population parameters for each stock unit and analyze model performance. A sub-bullet here of interest is to conduct projections assuming uncertainty in current and future conditions for all stocks and compare projections retrospectively with model estimates. TOR 6 is to update simple empirical indicator-based trend analyses of abundance, exploitation, fishery performance, and environmental stress for stock or substock areas, modify or develop new indicators if warranted. TOR 7 is to evaluate the current regime-based exploitation and abundance reference points, recommend modifications to these reference points if necessary. TOR 8 is to characterize uncertainty of model estimates, reference points, and stock status. TOR 9 is to perform retrospective analyses, assess the magnitude and direction of retrospective patterns detected, and discuss implications of any observed retrospective patterns for uncertainty in population parameters and reference points. TOR 10 is to report stock status as related to overfishing and depleted reference points, include simple description of the historical and current condition of the stock in layman's terms. TOR 11 is to address and incorporate to the extent possible recommendations from the 2020 benchmark peer review. TOR 12 is to develop detailed short and long-term prioritized lists of recommendations for future research, data collection, and assessment methodology, highlight improvements to be made by next benchmark review. TOR 13 is to recommend timing of next benchmark assessment and intermediate updates if necessary relative to the biology and current management of the species. and those are our assessment TORs. So now jumping into the proposed assessment timeline, this slide shows the major milestones coming up with the assessment. We have a data deadline for early 2024. We'll then meet as a technical committee and stock assessment subcommittee at a data workshop in February of 2024. We have 2 assessment workshops scheduled, one in June of 2024 and one in October of 2024, to develop models and finalize those models, stock status, reference points for the assessment. We'll finalize the assessment report from the SAS in January of 2025, and then have that assessment reviewed by the technical committee in February of 2025. We'll have our peer review workshop in May of 2025, and then we'll present the assessment and review reports to the Lobster Management Board in August 2025. And next slide, please. And just a note here, the stock assessment subcommittee was approved by this board in July via email. I did just want to note that we have the same stock assessment subcommittee as our last assessment in 2020. We did lose one member, however. Kim McCown from New York DEC retired. She was also our SAS chair. So I would just note that if anyone knows of additional folks out there that would be interested in collaborating on the assessment and supporting in any way, we would have open ears to that. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation and take any questions on the TORs.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. And thanks for spinning through that so rapidly. So questions, or you can offer, anything on the terms of reference of the timeline. Pat Kelleher.
I don't want to stand in y'all's lunch, in the way of y'all's lunch here. TOR 4, could you put that back up, Jeff? I do have a motion to change it, but I don't know if it could just simply be done with an agreement if everybody is there. Whoops. So there was this TOR 4 deals with kind of the climactic side of the issues with the assessment, and we did look at temperature issues the last time around. And we had a lot of conversations with staff at DMR, and one of the thoughts was to include environmental and climactic drivers on stock abundance, considering annual to decadal scales. And I've got a motion to recognize that.
Yeah, let's get right to that, Pat. So there'll be a motion. Go ahead.
Yeah, to identify, describe, and if possible, quantify the effect of environmental and climatic drivers on stock abundance, considering annual to decadal scales.
Okay, so there's a motion on the board from Pat Kelleher to modify term of reference 4 as presented up here, or on the webinar, or up on the screens here. Is there a second to that motion? Doug Rout seconds the motion. So we've got a motion, it's been seconded. Anything else, Pat, that you want to add to the discussion here?
Just obviously we've heard it, and you heard it from even Dustin Delano, when the fishermen are starting to recognize that climate change is becoming a driver. I think we need to maybe put a little bit more emphasis within the terms of reference.
Thanks, Pat. Doug, anything to add? Nothing from Doug. Any other discussion on the motion? This is a modification to one of the terms of reference. Seeing no hands around the table. Any online? No hands online. So we've got a motion. It's been seconded. I don't know if that's right. Are there any objections to the motion that's on the board? Please raise your hand if so. No hands in the room, no hands online, so the motion passes by consent. Thanks for that, Pat. Any other modifications, comments on terms of reference? Looking around the room, not seeing any. Now actually looking in the back of the room, not seeing any back there either. Any online? Okay, good. So with that, Jeff, I think you have your modifications to the terms of reference, and there were no comments on the timeline. Great. All right, so the next agenda item here was something I was going to give a quick presentation on management strategy evaluation. We are going to punt that to January. So I'm going to skip that agenda item. Caitlin already offered that she is going to handle the FMP reviews. I think you said online via email. So we'll skip over that agenda item as well, which brings us to our other business. And Pat, I will start with the item that you offered. So go ahead, Pat.
Just to help expedite, I do have a motion that maybe if we put that up on the board and then I can speak to that.
I love it. Let's get that up on the board.
Just so everybody's aware, the New England Council has begun efforts to reopen the northern edge to the scallop fishery. And I know this is a Pierce-esque type motion, but I'll read it into the record. If I get a second, I'll dig into the rationale. Move to task the Lobster TC to compile information on the lobster resource and fishery in and around the northern edge of Georges Bank. This is in relationship to a potential action at the New England Fisheries Management Council, which is considering scallop fishery access on the northern edge. A starting place for this tasking could be reviewing the information that the Lobster TC compiled when ASMFC commented on the Council's Omnibus Habitat Amendment 2. Areas of interest include information on the presence and abundance of lobsters, including ovigerous lobster in and around the northern edge by month and season, lobster fishery effort in and around the northern edge by month and season, potential impacts of mobile gear on the lobster population in this area, and information on the habitat type and depth preference of lobster, which could inform our understanding of lobster on the northern edge if there are limitations in the data.
Okay.
I missed one. And whether current reported by Area 3 vessels as representative or an understanding of the lobster effort in the northern edge area, and how future requirements, i.e. federal EVTR requirements of vessel tracking, will impact the data availability.
Okay, so we have a motion by Pat Kelleher. Is there a second to that motion? Doug Rout seconds the motion. Thanks, Doug. Okay, so Pat, anything to add?
I mean, a lot of the rationale is really built into the motion, but I would say that, I mean, the fact that this has been an area that's been closed for a long time to scallop fishing, it's a very rich lobstering grounds. We're certainly going to see a lot of gear conflict there when 200 plus boats become actively engaged in looking for scallops in the area. So I think I think we need to have a closer look at this, and we need to start with the TC. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Doug, anything to add? Nothing from Doug. David Borden, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad Pat raised this. I appreciate that. I think the motion does a good job of describing what the technical people need to look at. And I just remind everybody that we went through this about 7 or 8 years ago, as you'll recall. And the commission basically took a position at my urging to oppose it. There are times in this fishery where 80% of the lobsters are ovigerous females. And the damage rate at certain times of the year for dredges is up to 60%. So it's a real concern, given the fact that we just finished a section talking about the indices of abundance and lobsters going down. We have to be really careful on this one. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Dan McKiernan, go ahead.
I have good news. Because Massachusetts raced out and required trackers as of May 1, we might have most of a year worth of data that we could share for the Massachusetts-based Area 3 fleet.
Great, thank you for that, Dan. Okay, any further discussion around the table? Any hands online? Okay, no hands online. So I'm going to go ahead and call the question here. We've got a motion that's been seconded. Are there any objections to the motion tasking the TC? Please raise your hand if you object. Are you objecting, Ray? Okay, no objections, no hands around the table, no hands online, so the motion passes by consent. Thanks, Pat. We had a second other business item, and so David, I will turn it over to you, and Ally, I'll be sure to come to you as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I'll try to make this brief, Mr. Chairman. We had this issue of the proposed rule that NOAA sent out, and we commented on it and asked for additional time. And I very much appreciate the fact that NOAA accommodated us and send my thanks, and I'm sure the commission thanks. Mandatory, there are three components of the rule. You got mandatory reporting. I think everyone's in concurrence that should go into effect immediately. Then on the Area 2 and the Area 3 portions of it, I've talked to Pat and Dan McKernan in particular, and you, Mr. Chairman, and your staff. And I think there's a need for us to kind of follow the protocol that we have established in previous discussions on this. These recommendations were formalized by the industry for both Area 2 and Area 3 by the respective LCMTs. And that was 10 years ago, over 10 years ago. And I think there's a responsibility on our part to take the proposed rule in conjunction with the NOAA staff back to the LCMTs and ask them to review it and formulate comments. And then I think the appropriate action then that could take place over the next month or two. Then we get put it on the agenda and formalize a recommendation for NOAA. The main reason I'm saying that is the situation is, and I'll give you just a short example, the situation has so dramatically changed from when the regulation was originally put in place, when we meaning the commission adopted the addendum. There was one entity that owned 6 boats. Now we're in a situation where basically 70% of the fishing effort in Area 3 is owned by 5 companies. So it's completely changed. It's a reverse. Part of the objective of us doing what we did was to kind of slow down the consolidation, but it took place anyways. And then there are other reasons, I think, that if we hold an industry discussion, issues like the Area 2 indices that we just reviewed are falling like a stone. So I think we may get very different recommendations out of the industry if we hold discussions with them. So Dan at least has volunteered to work with Rhode Island and any of the other states to put together a virtual LCMT meeting, I think, and then bring recommendations back. So I would hope that would be the course of action we would follow. And if we need to, we could send a letter to NOAA basically summarizing that from the staff to staff letter saying this is the way we intend to handle it. So that's my recommendation.
Thank you, David. Ally, I'll offer you some space to make a comment or two if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. David talked a little bit about this, but I just wanted to summarize for the board what was in our interim final rule. 3 things that complemented Lobster board actions in Addenda 21, 22, and 26. First is mandatory electronic harvester reporting using the federal electronic vessel trip report, and that would be implemented on April 1st, 2024. For Area 2, we're implementing an ownership cap that would restrict most entities to 800 traps, but allow those who are over as of May 1st, 2023 to keep those traps, but not purchase additional traps. And then for Area 3, we're implementing maximum trap cap reductions over 3 years and associated ownership caps that will reduce over 3 years.
And again, an entity that exceeded those limits as of May 1, 2023 could keep their current trap allocation. Based on the comments that we received, including from the commission, we're accepting some additional comment on that. I'd be happy to discuss the rule in additional detail at an upcoming meeting, and I'm happy to work with the states if they're going to host LCMT meetings to provide additional information.
Great, thanks, Ally. So I'm just going to consult here for a second to see if what we need to do to implement this. So hang on one second. Okay, so we don't need a motion, but what can happen is the states can convene the LCMTs on their own. They don't need guidance from the board or the commission to do that. And so if you're able to successfully convene those LCMT meetings, you can report back and then we'll add it to a future agenda. So I think we can move forward with what you've suggested, David, and if we're successful in that, we can loop back here with the commission at a future meeting. Great. All right, so that, any discussion on that? Sorry. Anyone want to add anything to that discussion? Not seeing any hands, so I'm just going to keep rolling forward. That brings us to the end of our agenda. So I'm just kind of looking around the table to see if anybody's looking antsy to offer anything else. They're not. So I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Moved by Pat Kelleher, seconded by everyone. And any objections to the motion? Seeing none, we are adjourned. Thanks, everybody.